Welcome to Her Remarkable History. Remember, to support our channel, please subscribe. The horrific afterlife of the forgotten Scottish Queen. Throughout history, there have been a number of kings and queens who after their death were treated very poorly. Catherine of Valois was a Queen of England, whose remains for 450 years were left unburied inside of Westminster Abbey. People would flock to visit the bones of her, and some even handled them and even kissed her skeleton. It was considered great luck for someone to touch the bones of a monarch, but this of course today would be viewed as disturbing and shocking. The Queen of Richard II, inside of Westminster Abbey, also even had her bones taken from her coffin, and these were removed from a hole in the side of the tomb. People made off with her remains, and still today these have not been returned and have been lost. But there was one Scottish queen whose remains were also tampered with, and they went on a remarkable journey. It was said that even Margaret of Scotland's head was once owned by Mary Queen of Scots, but over the centuries it's believed that her remains and bones have been lost. But there is a part of her remains which shockingly can still be seen. But what is the story of the horrific afterlife of the forgotten Scottish Queen? Margaret was born in 1046 and was a member of the House of Wessex. She was a direct descendant of King Alfred the Great and was the granddaughter of King Edmund Ironside through his son Edward. Along with her family, Margaret had been exiled to the east when King Canute and his Viking Danish army arrived in England and caused chaos and much bloodshed. Margaret was known for being a beautiful and pious woman, and she was educated in Hungary. However, towards the end of her great-uncle Edward the Confessor's reign, Margaret and her family came back to England. Her younger brother Edgar, the Atheling, was considered a strong claimant to the English throne, and he was the only one who claimed the throne following Edward's death, who possessed royal blood. But the Witan and English nobility would select and elect Harold Godwinson as the successor to Edward's throne. With this, Harold II was crowned, and he was a popular Earl of Wessex, but a man who also claimed the throne was William the Conqueror, who would kill and defeat Harold's army at the Battle of Hastings. Margaret and her family were some of the last remaining Saxon royals in England, and with the Normans advancing, they feared for their lives and they fled to the north. Their ship was destined for Europe, however they were blown off course and they landed in Scotland, and specifically Fife. Because of this, the Scottish king Malcolm III then offered the family and Margaret royal protection. However, he had a soft spot for Margaret, and he proposed to her, and she initially refused to marry the Scottish king, as she wanted to stay pure. However, Malcolm would be very persistent, and the couple would marry in Dunfermline in 1069, and together they would have 8 children, 6 sons and 2 daughters. A number of those would go on to become kings of Scotland, and one of her daughters would become Queen of England. The Scots liked Margaret, and she brought a number of positives to the Scottish court and made it more civilised. Margaret and her religious devotion was also a good influence on her husband, and she was a leading figure behind reform in the Scottish Church. The working class greatly respected her, and she went on to found churches, monasteries, pilgrimage hostels and royal mausoleums at Dunfermline Abbey. She also allowed and paid for a crossing for pilgrims to visit the shrine of St Andrew. She brought the Scottish Church in line with the Catholic beliefs dominating European worship, but she was greatly respected also for her attitude towards the needy and the poor. She cared for the poor and the orphans, and she would fast greatly, but this caused damage to her health. In the weeks before her death, 1093, she was informed that her husband and her eldest son had been ambushed and brutally killed at the Battle of Alnwick in Northumbria. Just 3 days after her husband and son's death, Margaret too would die on the 16th of November 1093, allegedly from grief. She had already been ill, but she was then buried in Dunfermline Abbey. However, in the centuries after, her remains would be tampered with, and shocking events would occur around them. In 1245 it was noted that brilliant flashes of light were coming from her tomb, An appeal was made to the Pope and she was canonised. The Pope said that a precious pearl saw the light in Hungary and lived at the court of the Confessor, a school of holiness. Torn from homeland, you embraced another. You became queen and mother, the glory of Scots. Your queen's crown, a crown of charity. Your way, the royal way of the cross. Once mere men placed crowns upon your head, but I, innocent Peter's successor, servant of Christ, now place upon your head the greatest crown of all, sainthood. But 8 months after this, a new tomb had been completed for her, and it was ready for her remains. On the 13th of July 1250, the body of St. Margaret, which had been in the ground almost 200 years, was dug up and then moved in the presence of the Scottish king. It was said of her exhumation, "With the utmost devoutness and honour, a silver shrine set with gold and precious stones, and from her earlier tomb was given out a most sweet smell, so that one would have thought the whole place was stewed with flowers. God neither wished nor would allow the remains of the blessed Queen to be moved before the coffin of her husband, King Malcolm, were opened, and his body moved with such just honours, since they were one flesh while they were in the world." Malcolm's remains were also reinterred towards the new tomb of his wife. Queens would turn to St. Margaret of Scotland for protection during childbirth. The daughter of Henry VII would pay to obtain Margaret's protection. For 3 centuries, lights were burned around the tomb, and an oak cabinet was kept near which held her relics. This consisted of her skull, which had auburn golden flowing hair and other bones. However, this tomb was later destroyed by Scottish religious reformers in 1560. Margaret's tomb was destroyed and desecrated. The group destroyed parts of the monastic buildings, and Dunfermline Abbey was targeted, and the shrine of St. Margaret was broken and spoiled. However, the monks anticipated this, had hidden away the reliquary of St. Margaret. But at this time, the head of Margaret was enclosed in a separate reliquary, and it was taken to Edinburgh Castle at the request of Mary Queen of Scots, who was awaiting the birth of James VI. Her head, after this, was then given to the Scots College of Douai in France, where it was worshipped and took care of. Her skull was enclosed in a bust, where there was a crown of silver gilt which was enriched with pearls and precious stones. On the eve of the French Revolution, the relic was still seen by a Scottish priest, who said it remained at Scots College. It was complete, and the Queen's auburn hair was still on it. However, during the chaos of the Revolution, it was said to have been hidden away, but then it disappeared. The remaining relics of St. Margaret were allegedly then carried to Flanders and found their way into the possession of the Spanish monarchy. It was said when the relic headed to Flanders, the coffer wherein were the head and hair of St. Margaret in the year 1597 were delivered into the hands of the fathers of the Society of Jesus, the missioners in Scotland, who, seeing it was in danger to be lost or profaned by seditious heretics, transported it to Antwerp. The chapel where her remains were held were decorated in artwork dedicated to her. However, it would later be transported back to Scotland. 2 chests were found, and one was marked with St. Margaret's name, and the other had her husband's name. Inside of this chest, marked with her name, the bones of the shoulder of St. Margaret was encased, measuring 7 inches in length and 5 inches in breadth. The relic was then handed over to Scottish Bishop Gills, and it was repatriated back to Scotland. It was said of her shoulder bone that the bone was carefully detached with a smaller bone with a saw, sealed with wax and signed with the monastery seal. It was housed inside of an ornate reliquary, and still today the relics and shoulder bone of St. Margaret can be viewed inside this container. What remains a mystery today, though, is the location of the rest of St. Margaret's remains and bones. Her skull and head, which were once in the possession of Mary Queen of Scots, still is lost today, and the whereabouts of her head are unknown. It may have disappeared during the French Revolution, during the time of great upheaval and chaos. Forensic investigation has occurred on the remains of the skull to try and work out specifically what killed St. Margaret. St. Margaret was a woman who was devout much of her life to the protection and help of the poor and needy in society. She was a Scottish queen who would have, in a different life, have played an important part in English politics too, before the invasion of the Normans. However, in the centuries after her death, her remains were dug up and were then interred inside a number of different places, before the only part of her to return to Scottish soil was her shoulder. Thank you for watching, and to support, please subscribe to Her Remarkable History. Thank you.